Let's talk a little bit about wild clay. So there are examples from all over the world of artists using clay from right under their feet, what's available to them. And the way that they utilize those clays and the way that they process the clay and then the way they shape the clay and then fire it is what determines the quality of the final piece. And I think that's really the most important thing to consider when you're talking about good clay, is that it's not necessarily something inherent in the clay itself that makes it good, but the artistry that's applied to it. So the first example here is a Korean teacup made by Master Kang Hyo. And this is a wild clay. It's an iron-bearing clay, really, really rough, lots of grit in it that he digs himself. And it's coated with this white clay. This white clay is a slip. That's what we call it in ceramics. It's like paint, but it's white clay that we paint over the surface, thin, sort of the consistency of whole milk. And the white clay, when it's applied to the iron clay, causes all of these colors because the iron pulls out through the white slip and you get these beautiful variations in surface and color. And this is really a great example of buncheongware, which is a Korean style that's been done for hundreds of years and highly coveted by the Japanese tea masters and, ceramic lovers worldwide. So here's my second example. This is a wood-fired pot from Taiwan. And the thing it has in common, of course, is that it's wild clay. So this is wild clay that's dug out of the mountains of Taiwan by Li Lao Shi, which is teacher Li in Mandarin. And so he takes the clay, he forms them into these beautiful cups, very, very smooth outer surface, and then he carves the cups with these flowers. Then the way that he gets the depth of surface is with the wood fire. And he very carefully controls how he fires to get this wonderful surface and variation in color. And he's following sort of the same recipe. Find your local clay, process it in a way that works well for the clay, that you end up with a beautiful functional end result, and then fire it in a wood kiln in this case, whereas this one was fired in a gas kiln, and bring out the best in the color and the surface of the clay. My third example is this pot from Tokoname. So this is a Japanese pot. It follows, believe it or not, about the same recipe. They're taking their local clay, and it's a little bit of a finer particle. It's very, very easy to work with. And they can make these very, very thin, very detailed vessels. And then you can see they're also carving on the surface. And they have these beautiful, this is a peony, beautiful carvings of peony on the pot. It's a really fine, beautiful, thin detail pot. And then it's fired in reduction, and that's what gives you this beautiful sort of burgundy brown color. So that's the philosophy that I like to follow, and the thing that I really connect with the most is using the clay under my feet and then learning how to process that clay and how to form it and then how to fire it to get the best out of the clay. This is the example I've used before. This is my favorite teapot from the first wood firing I did in Georgia, and it's made from Lizella clay, which is a rough, local iron-bearing clay that's dug out of a creek bed. And then I mix it with another local clay, not unlike this porcelain here, this white color. So I mix it with a local Georgia clay that's a really fine particle white clay, and it gives me the ability to fire this hot enough to be vitrified and ready to take on tea. Because obviously it needs to be watertight, but without glaze, it has to just have a tight enough matrix and be glassified or vitrified enough to hold water. So I developed the clay body, I mixed the right proportions of my local clays, and then based on what the clay allowed me to do, I was able to make very thin, fine vessels, nice, curvy, small additions, really thin lip on the spout to try to prevent dripping, although it doesn't always. Really fine details on the lid, and I'm able to carve my little faces. So I found a clay that I like the look of, and I like the feel of, and I know that it's going to give me interesting textures at the end of the day. And then I learned how to process it, which means blending it with different clays, and I learned how to form it, which for me means throwing it on the wheel, and sort of testing how thin I can make it, how thick it needs to be, how voluminous I can make the structures before they want to collapse. And this is a really good structural clay that can be thrown, pushed pretty hard. And then I took it and I fired it in a wood kiln where I knew it would get a lot of reduction and give me this vitrified, really glassified surface. And I think that's really the crux of it. When you start with clay that you know, and you've worked with for a really long time, you know what that clay needs to become good teaware. And at the end of the day, it's the same recipe that the I Ching potters have used. So they took clay that they knew, and they processed the clay in a way that best suits the way that they want to form it. And then they don't use a wheel, they actually use hand-built and paddles and blending tools, and it's a really beautiful process. And then they fire it in a way that best suits the clay so that it is nice and vitrified and good for clay, or good for tea rather. So at the end of the day, there's not really good clay. It's good artists and brilliant craftsmen taking the materials that are available to them and making something beautiful with it. Cheers, everybody.